So virtual networks is the next section then. So we have different ways of connecting, the enterprise and the Windows Azure data center together. So one of them is just simple forward SQL data sync. So you could have a SQL server in your on-premises environment, a SQL server in the cloud, and you could synchronize the data across those. You can actually take a SQL server in one data center and a SQL server in another data center and synchronize them. At the application layer, we have service bus, which will allow you to take a message from an application and move that across to another application. But this is what developers do at this kind of level. But then down at the networking level, we've got two ways of connecting. One is secure machine-to-machine connectivity, and that's called Windows Azure Connect. That's where we have a bit of point software on each machine. So a bit of software on this machine, a bit of software on this machine, and it allows those two machines to communicate with each other. So if you were, if you were running an enterprise and you were responsible for 1,000 desktops, and you wanted those 1,000 desktops to connect to this one virtual machine, you'd have to do 1,000 installs of that software. So as soon as you get outside of two servers wanting to talk to each other, that's when the next thing comes in, which is secure site-to-site network connectivity. And that's a virtual network. So what is a Windows Azure virtual network? So you can see this diagram here. We've got a cloud, Windows Azure Cloud. It's got a couple of domain controllers, a SharePoint server, a file server, a SQL server. And we've also got the green blob here, which represents a on-premises network. And it's got some servers on it. It's got a couple of domain controllers. So to get these things connected up with each other, what we do is we have a VPN device from Juniper or Cisco. In fact, you can also use TMG. And we connect the network up. And that's simply what we do. And what that means is that we've effectively extended our corporate network into the Windows Azure data center, but not into the entire data center, only into our segment of the data center where our resources are held. So if I've created 4 VMs, or in this case 5 VMs, they're on my isolated network segment that nobody else has access to, and I've just extended the corporate network into that part of the Azure data center. And that means that all those machines see each other as if that VPN device is just simply a router between the two bits of the network. And so it means that we can start sending messages between each other. So, one machine can talk to another machine, can talk to another machine, can talk to another machine, just as if they were just as if it was a branch office, for example, and I was connecting them all together via a VPN through that mechanism. As far as the device list is concerned, this is the list. I'm sure the slides will be available afterwards. I've also put in the slides here, you can use TMG, and there's a blog here which shows you some very specific setup that you have to do. It's not just as simple as just installing TMG and hitting the go button. There's some very specific configurations that you need to make. And then generic VPN devices need to support these protocols: IKE v1, Internet Key Exchange, Advanced Encryption Standard, and SHA. I think that's a secure. I can't remember what that stands for actually, but SHA-1 and SHA-2. So if you've got any of these devices, you can use a virtual network. And now, Windows Azure and Active Directory VMs comes into this area because we need to run a an Active Directory virtual machine in a Windows Azure virtual network. So, oh, sorry. One of the things I didn't do before I moved on to virtual networks. Sorry about that. Let me go back a little bit. Before we get into Windows Azure virtual networks, the one thing I didn't do was demo the creation of a virtual machine. So let me do a demo of that. It's a pretty fundamental part of the whole thing, really. So let's give that a go. So I go to the portal. Let me get rid of that portal there. And I go to the virtual machine section, and I say new, virtual machine from gallery. And I can create a, let's just say a Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1. Oh, that's annoying. I need to change the zoom on this. Okay. And I give it a name. So let's call this TechDays 12. Create a password for the default administrator's account. Specify a size of virtual machine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a standalone virtual machine with its own DNS name. So I'll call this TechDays UK VM. Let's call it VM. So that machine will now have a URL of techdaysukvm.cloudapp.net. I will use an automatically generated storage account to store the data. I will put it into a specific data center. I'll choose North Europe, which is my local one, Dublin. I won't bother with an availability set, and you'll find out what they are in a few moments. And I'll hit go. So that's now going through the process of provisioning for me a virtual machine. Now, I can also create Linux machines. So if I go into here and I say new, I can say virtual machine from gallery. And I could, for example, take an OpenLogic CentOS 6.2 machine, and I could do the same thing. So let's just call this one OpenLogic TechDays. A bit long, that name, isn't it? Let's try OpenLogic TechDays. How about that? It will have a default super username of Azure user, and we'll put a password in here. I could go through the process of uploading an SSH key for authentication. I don't actually have one, so I'm just going to skip over that part there. It's going to need to be connected to the internet, so I'll give it a name, which will be OpenLogic TechDays. Let's make sure, yep, that's an OK name. I'll automatically generate a storage account for this. I'll put it into North Europe. Click OK and say, OK, so that's going to go away and create a Linux virtual machine for me. So we'll come back and we'll see how well they're doing. It usually takes a few minutes to get them provisioned. But what's happening now is those images are being provisioned onto a rack. Now, I said earlier that what you could also do is you could create your own images. And you may have noticed that I have one in there. Virtual machine from gallery. If I go to my images, I've got a standard SharePoint 2010 sysprepped image there, and I've got another one which I call the SP base VM. So I could create another one of those if I wanted to. I could go SP base VM, and I could go through this whole process and create virtual machines. And all that would be is a sysprepped machine which has all of the SharePoint binaries on it that I need. So I can just run through the configuration of the machine and the configuration of SharePoint, and I will have myself a SharePoint image up and running. So it's as simple as that. If I want to upload a machine, then I go to the Windows Azure command prompt and I type CS upload /?. That gives me help on CS upload. And CS upload is the tool that I use to copy the VHD from my on-premises environment up to the cloud. Now, bear in mind that image is probably going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 gigabytes, depending on how much stuff you've got on it. So that may well take 24, 48 hours to copy. So you do have to sort of bear in mind the size of an image and what your network bandwidth is to get that image copied up to the Windows Azure data center. Okay, we'll come back and check that in a few moments, but let's go back to the slides. Where did I get to? I got to Windows Azure Active Directory and VMs. Okay, so here we are. We've got an Active Directory. It's on a corporate network. It's got a couple of Active Directory domain controllers, and they are going to replicate to each other as they normally would. If I had something like a branch office and I had a network connection to it, then I could, create a VPN. And if that was a private network, I wouldn't need to do this, but I could use the internet maybe for a VPN. And maybe in that branch office, I'd have a domain controller, a SharePoint server, a file server, a SQL server. And that would allow me to replicate data from the domain controllers to each other and service the users in that location. So SharePoint users, for example, they're going to need a SQL server, they're going to need a SharePoint server, they're going to need a domain controller. File server, it could be useful in that scenario. So I could do another one. I could have another branch office, I could create another VPN, I could do the replication, and that would be great. The thing is that second branch office doesn't necessarily have to be in an on-premises environment. We could run that in the cloud. So that could be 4 VMs in a Microsoft data center providing services to a local community of users. Maybe it's in a different country, or maybe it's just a, it's a subset of users. Customers, for example. Maybe you want to give some of your customers their own SharePoint environment. So that could be running in that completely separated environment. And what this actually means is also that you could do without the virtual private network to connect the two things together, because you've got a domain controller in there. So you could run that domain controller as an Active Directory in a standalone environment with its entire infrastructure without having to connect it to your own network. So although virtual networks allow you to connect an existing on-premises environment to the cloud, you don't have to. You can run a selection of virtual machines in their own virtual network, and the advantage of doing this is that you can bring your own infrastructure with you, like DNS, for example, because normally Windows Azure will provide the DNS, but you can bring this with you. In fact, you could get rid of the entire on-premises environment if you wanted to and run all of this in the cloud. So you would do all of your management, all of your IT service management, which you're used to doing. You sit down at your desk and you type lots of commands into lots of management tools, and they all talk to servers which are usually down in the basement or in a data center somewhere. Well, that data center, you could be doing all of that stuff, but that data center could be in a Microsoft-owned and run data center where you don't have your own hardware. And there are sessions about things like System Center Operations Manager and those sorts of things which help to make that whole process much easier, so that you don't have your own data center, but you still manage the infrastructure. It's just run on a virtual network in somebody else's data center. And you pay per hour for each of the CPUs and per gigabyte for the storage that you use, as opposed to buying the hardware and using that hardware over a number of years and getting the value out of it. Okay, so one of the reasons you might want to do this is because you might want to set up a completely isolated environment to give maybe, for example, SharePoint services to a collection of users. Completely and utterly isolated and separate from your own network. Or maybe you would like to provide some IT support services to a small business who has no IT infrastructure. Well, look, they've got a complete IT infrastructure there. All they need is a few laptops and desktop computers to connect to this complete infrastructure that's running in the cloud. You might want to have another domain controller. It doesn't matter. You just simply deploy the amount of resources that you need to provide that infrastructure for that business, or for that department, or for that company. So you could have a standalone domain in the cloud, and that would mean that you would just have a virtual network, a Windows Azure virtual network, entirely within the perimeter of the Windows Azure cloud. Or you could have a connected domain in the cloud. In that case, you would have a virtual network which connects to an on-premise virtual private network device. Okay, so both of those options are open to you. Now let's have a look at that virtual network thing that I was talking about. When we create a virtual network, we have to define an address space that we are going, the range of addresses that are going to be in our virtual network. So in this example, you can see I've got 192.168.0.0/16. So I think you probably know the CIDR format, CIDR, which says that the slash and the 16 is the mask that is applied to the top, in this case, 16 bits. So what it means is that that top 16 bits is masked off, and I am now therefore going to have 0.0 through to, what's that going to be, ff.ff. I think that comes out to 65,536 addresses that I can use. Of course, I can't use 0, I can't use FFFF, which means I have 65,534 addresses, 65,534 nodes that I could possibly address in this virtual network. Okay, then once I've got my virtual network address space, and I've got plenty of provision there for dividing this, I'll create subnets. And they're also defined in CIDR format. So in this case, you can see I've got 3 subnets. I've got 0.0, 1.0, and 2.0. And notice it's the top 24 bits that are masked off this time. So notice that one there. So I could have up to 255 nodes in this network, 192.168.0. Or the blue one, which is 192.168.1.0. Or the light green one, 192.168.2.0. So that's how I create my virtual networks. And then I could put a domain controller into one of those virtual networks, and let's just imagine that that domain is called yourdomain.com, and that will be its name. Now, if I was to decide to connect this particular subnet up to one of my on-premise subnets, then that domain controller could participate in domain replication. And if the domain was called yourdomain.com, then I've extended my on-premises network into my cloud. I could then put a SQL server into that network and I could domain join it. I could put a couple of SharePoint VMs into that network and I could domain join them as well. And one of the other things I could do is I connect those SharePoint services up to the cloud, up to the network itself via the load balancer. So I can do that by creating an endpoint at port 80, and the load balancer will then automatically load balance across those different servers. So requests will come in from the internet and they'll go to SharePoint 0, SharePoint 1, SharePoint 0, SharePoint 2 and 1 as I've got them mentioned here. And that's the way the load balancer works. It just simply load balances across different instances. It does nothing more than that. And it's round-robin load balancing. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's modified round-robin load balancing because I've experimented with this quite a bit. And you'll find that it goes, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0. It seems to be a little bit random the way that it does it, but it does load balance across the two instances that you connect up to the load balancer. So here comes the question, how do you connect a couple of instances up to a load balancer? So enter stage left, another quick demo. Let's see how our virtual machines are doing. Let me kill this one off. Oh, and we've got some questions. I'll just finish this off and we'll have a look. So I go to virtual machines. There's my TechDays 12. That one looks like it's deployed, so I can connect to this through a remote desktop connection. So I reckon that was about 8 minutes to deploy that, which is pretty good, really. So here we go, there's my desktop. It's going to take a little while to log in because, the very first time you ever log into a brand new machine with a desktop takes a while to build it. But why don't we go through this now and let's build another machine, virtual machine from gallery, server 2008. Let's call this one TechDays VM2. Okay, now come some important questions. I can connect it to an existing virtual machine, which means it will be on the same network. So if I take that one there, the one I created earlier, techdaysukvm.cloudapp.net, I'll use an automatically generated storage account, and I want to actually put that onto a different network. Doesn't see, here we go, North Europe. Okay, I won't bother with an availability set, and I'll say OK to that. Now, while that machine is deploying, let's go back to our first VM, which was that one there, was it? Yeah, that one there. And let's go to endpoints, and I'm going to add an endpoint. So I'm going to add an endpoint which will load balance traffic. So I'm going to add an endpoint, and I'll call this the HTTP port. And I'm going to say that it's port 80 in the outside world, and on the inside world it's also port 80. And I'll say OK to that. Got an error there on that virtual machine. What does it say? Why does it say that? Oh, I've exceeded the total number of cores. I'm going to delete a couple of machines. I think I'll delete that Linux machine because I'm not going to use it again. I have a limit of 20 cores on my services. So I've got a number deployed in that past service that I've got. I've got a number of dual core machines also deployed. So I've probably hit my 20 limit. So let me just go back to virtual machines. That one there, I think I'll delete that one there. Right, which means I have to wait for it to delete before I can deploy the new machine. But what you did see, you saw me create, or attempt to create an endpoint. No, sorry, I have created an endpoint on an existing VM, I'm now going to deploy a new VM, and I'm going to connect both of the endpoints up together and connect them to the same load balancer. Right, let's now go back to the slides. Okay, so we've got our infrastructure deployed. We're connected up to the same load balancer. We're taking requests off the internet. When I'm using virtual network, well, whether I'm using virtual networks or just the inbuilt Windows Azure network that's just there by default, I will be granted IP addresses. And those IP addresses have all the appearance of being DHCP addresses, although they're not. They're called DIPs, or dynamic IP addresses. And the real difference between them is that it's a little bit like a DHCP address with a lease that is infinite. It goes on forever. So the likelihood is, if you have an IP address from a DHCP server, it may well change in the life of that machine. In fact, most people have IP address leases somewhere between 3 days and 6 weeks, depending on the address pool that they have available. So in a DIP, what will happen is it means that if I boot a machine up, let's just say it gets an IP address, 192.168.1.4. If I then shut that machine down and reboot it again, it will get the same IP address. If I shut it down and reboot it again, it will get the same IP address. If I have 5 machines in that service, and I shut all 5 of them down and boot them all again, they'll all get the same IP addresses. So that's something significant about DIPs. DHCP is not used in Windows Azure, but in order to get those addresses, you have to configure the virtual machine as if it is using a DHCP address. And in fact, if you specify a static address, what will happen is the fabric that is running the data center will detect that you're using an illegal IP address, and it will stop routing traffic to it. So, doctor, it hurts when I do that. Well, don't do it then. So don't use static IP addresses either in virtual networks or in the normal Windows Azure networks. And then we have this idea of virtual IP addresses, and that is a single IP address that is used to connect your service, no matter how many virtual machines are in your service, to the internet. And that IP address probably will change. It tends to not change, but over a period, if you were to leave it for a year, it'll probably change. So we use DNS names, really. The DNS name won't change, but the IP address may change. If the IP address does change, then DNS will automatically be updated to reflect the latest change. Right, bear that in mind because we've got a few questions. Let's have a look at what the questions were. If I turn off a VM in Azure, does it persist? And am I still charged whilst it's not running? Okay, so in Windows Azure, if you can't really switch a machine off, you could RDP into it and you could say shut down. That's a kind of like switching it off, isn't it? And the way to think about this is a little bit like a rental car. If you rent a car, then whether you're driving it or whether it's parked in a hotel car park overnight while you're away on business, it doesn't matter. You're being charged for it. And the reason you're being charged is because if you've got the car, nobody else can use it and they can't make any money out of another customer. So think about a rack, think about a host in a rack, think about a virtual machine that is taking up resources on that rack. If that happens, then whether the machine is actually executing CPU cycles or not, if it's taking up resources, if it's on that rack, if it's on that virtual machine host and it's taking up resources, you're charged for it. So it's not whether it's running or not that counts, it's whether it's deployed onto a virtual host or not. And the only way to undeploy it from a virtual host is to delete it. It doesn't delete the data. So let's just imagine you've installed a virtual machine, you've installed some software onto it, it's now a package, it's now a complete package of data. If you delete that machine, then that data gets written to blob storage and you can deploy it again if you want to. All the time it's undeployed, you won't be charged for it, but you will be charged for it whether it's running or not and it's deployed onto that rack. Are there options to send images to Microsoft via a courier, for example, on a disk for upload into Azure? Actually, that's a good question. I did see something about this on a forum. I think in the next break I'll find the answer to that question because there's been a little bit of chat about that on various forums. And it certainly was something that Microsoft was talking about. And I can see that this question has come from the amount of time it might take to deploy, if you wanted to deploy 30 virtual machines, for example. So I'll find the latest thinking on that and whether that's a possibility or not. I think not. Okay, the next question is, I thought TMG was being discontinued. That's true, TMG is being discontinued. It doesn't stop it from being a piece of technology that is available and supports all those protocols and everything to use in Windows Azure. It's not on the supported devices list, but any device that supports those protocols that I was talking about will work in Windows Azure, but it's just that you're on your own if it decides not to work. Okay. Right, let's carry on with where we were. So we've talked about virtual networks. I just want to actually show you how to create a virtual network. It's actually a fairly simple thing to do. If I go into networks, and I say new virtual network, custom create, I give this a name, so I'll call this TechDays Demo Net. I could deploy it into an affinity group is like, for example, if I had a service, a cloud service, and a database deployed, I would probably want them to be right next to each other. And so I can create an affinity group which says that whenever I deploy to this affinity group, that service and that database will always be right next to each other. So I could either create a brand new affinity group, but I've already got one in North Europe here called NEDC, North Europe Data Center Affinity Group, NEDCAG. So I'll choose that one. I then give it an address space, so I could say it was like 192.168.0.0 as I did before, and mask off the top 16 bits. So that means that those bits at the top there, let's just zoom in, those bits at the very top up there are masked off. That's 16 bits which are masked off to define my address space. And then I could give a subnet a name. So I could call this one main, and I'll give this a address 192.168.3.0 whoops .3.0/24. So if I zoom into that again, let's put the cursor in the right place. Oops, something went wrong there. I've just been I'm actually using Internet Explorer Zoom here. Let's try again. That's better. So you can see here those top 24 bits are masked off, and I've now got a subnet which is this range of addresses here from 0 to 255. Okay. Okay, so I say that if I wanted to configure a connection to a local network, and I would need a gateway subnet and specify a local network, you know, on my VPN device, but I'm not going to do that because I don't actually have one. And I could specify DNS servers in my own local network if I wanted to. But I don't have any of that, so I just click OK, and it's going to go away, and it's going to create a network called TechDays Demo Net. It will be completely contained within the Azure data center, and I could, if I wanted to, deploy, let's just say, a Windows Azure domain controller onto that network, because then I could put my own DNS server onto it as well. OK, let's go back to the slides. So we've talked about the network. The next thing to talk about is the directory information tree. But I think in the interest of keeping you alert, we'll have another break. It's now 2:10. So let's take another 5-minute break and come back at 2:15 for the rest of this session.